Good evening and welcome to tonight's video for Wednesday night worship. We're carrying on in our journey through the book of Ecclesiastes. We're coming towards the end of this series. So if you've been sort of struggling your way through this difficult book, this challenging book, then the end is in sight. And actually tonight's passage, I think, is the key passage for understanding the book of Ecclesiastes. In addition to the very end of the book, I think for me, this portion of the book was the thing where everything clicked into place and where I really saw how we're supposed to understand and read this book and why this book is so helpful for us today. So I think this is an exciting part of the book that we're looking at tonight, and I hope that we're going to get a lot out of it as I share some thoughts on it now. And as we discuss those things and pray through those things afterwards on Zoom. So let me read our portion for tonight. It's from Ecclesiastes chapter 7. And I'm going to just read verses 23 to 29. It's just a short part. So Ecclesiastes 7, 23 to 29. It says this: "All this I tested by wisdom. And I said, I am determined to be wise, but this was beyond me. Whatever exists is far off and most profound. Who can discover it? So I turned my mind to understand, to investigate, and to search out wisdom and the scheme of things, and to understand the stupidity of wickedness and the madness of folly. I find more bitter than death the woman who is a snare, whose heart is a trap, and whose hands are chains. The man who pleases God will escape her, but the sinner she will ensnare. Look, says the teacher, this is what I have discovered, adding one thing to another to discover the scheme of things. While I was still searching but not finding, I found one upright man among 1,000, but not one upright woman among them all. This only have I found. God created mankind upright, but they have gone in search of many schemes." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. I don't know if you've had that experience. You must have had that experience where you're walking somewhere and you realise you're going in completely the wrong direction. I don't know, maybe you come out of a car or out of a car park, you start walking, you realise, this exact opposite direction to the one that I should be walking in. And, I guess most normal people would probably just stop, turn around and go back the other way. For some reason, I don't know, some strange pride thing, I don't find myself able to admit that, so I find myself trying to cover it over, doing these silly things. So I'll all of a sudden find something very interesting in a shop window and sort of muse on that, or all of a sudden have to bend down to tie my shoelace until everyone who saw me walking that direction has passed by so I can get up and walk the opposite direction. Or pretending to have a phone call, that's a good one. Walking in one direction, pick up the phone, well that information changes everything. Now I need to go back the other way. It can be a sort of a humbling, a bit of an embarrassing experience to accept that actually you're going completely the wrong direction and you need to turn around and go back. Well, that passage that I just read from Ecclesiastes, I think that's that moment for the teacher, where he realises in this quest for meaning, he's been going completely the wrong direction and he needs to turn around and go back. He has that moment of realisation that actually he's failed to find true wisdom. Verse 23, he says, I am determined to be wise, but this was beyond me. Whatever exists is far off and most profound. Who can discover it? We've seen by now, haven't we, how the teacher has seen, done, and tested everything there is to be done under the sun. But he still hasn't found what he's looking for. He still hasn't found that gain. All he's found is vapour, vapour, vapour. Everything is bubbles, if you like. He hasn't found that wisdom, that gain, that meaning that he's been looking for. He searched everywhere there was to search, but he couldn't find it. That's what we see here in verse 27 to 28, and there's some issues with the translation here that I think might obscure what's actually being said. So the NIV, as I just read it there, verse 27 says, "Look, says the teacher, this is what I've discovered, adding one thing to another to discover the scheme of things while I was still searching but not finding." Then the NIV says, "I found one upright man among 1,000, but not one upright woman among them all." Actually, in the Hebrew, there's no word upright there. It just says, "I found one man among 1,000, but not one woman among them all." And the word used for man isn't a word that Hebrew would tend to use for man as opposed to woman. Actually, the word man that's used, Adam, is the word for humanity, for people. So this isn't some sort of misogynistic statement that is being said here. What he's saying is, he's saying, look, I found one person in 1,000, but I've not found a woman. He said, I could find a needle in a haystack. I could pick out one person in 1,000. I could do that. I could search out all sorts of things, but I couldn't search out a woman. In all I searched for, I couldn't find this one woman. Now, we might be a bit puzzled about that. What does he mean? He can find lots of people, but he can't find a woman. We know back from chapter 2, he found a lot of women. That was one of the things he searched out, to find pleasure and satisfaction, and he found that too was vapor. No, the teacher here, I think, is talking about a very particular woman that he was searching out. And I think here he's alluding back to the book of Proverbs, the great book on wisdom. And in Proverbs chapter 9, wisdom, true wisdom, is portrayed as a woman. Lady Wisdom. Let me just read to you from Proverbs chapter 9. It speaks of wisdom as a lady. Wisdom has built her house. She has set up its 7 pillars. She has prepared her meat and mixed her wine. She's also set her table. She has sent out her servants, and she calls from the high point of the city, "Let those who are simple come to my house." To those who have no sense, she says, "Come, eat my food and drink the wine I have mixed. Leave your simple ways, and you will live. Walk in the way of insight." You see, Proverbs personifies wisdom as a woman who calls out to the simple, saying, come and, if you like, come and marry me, and you'll find wisdom, and you'll find life. And that's the woman the teacher was searching for. He was searching for wisdom. But he says he couldn't find her. He looked everywhere and he couldn't find this woman. But he did find another woman, he says. That's there in verse 26 of our reading. "I find more bitter than death the woman who is a snare, whose heart is a trap, and whose hands are chains. The man who pleases God will escape her, but the sinner she will ensnare." And here again, I think the teacher is referring to Proverbs chapter 9, because as well as Lady Wisdom, we have Dame Folly. As well as wisdom being personified as a woman calling out to the simple, so folly, foolishness, is portrayed as a woman as well. So again from Proverbs 9, it says, "Folly is an unruly woman. She is simple and knows nothing. She sits at the door of her house, on a seat at the highest point of the city, calling out to those who pass by, who go straight on their way, 'Let all who are simple come to my house.' To those who have no sense, she says, 'Stolen water is sweet. Food eaten in secret is delicious.' But little do they know that the dead are there, that her guests are deep in the realm of the dead." And this idea of folly being a woman to be avoided, a dangerous woman. Proverbs chapter 5, Proverbs chapter 7 is referred to as an adulterous woman that the young, simple, naive youth is to avoid. And we see the great irony here in what the teacher is saying. He's saying, look, I went on this quest to find wisdom, to find meaning. I said, I'm going to look at everything under the sun. I'm going to exclude God from the equation. And I'm going to find out wisdom. But he couldn't find Lady Wisdom. And instead he ran right into the arms of Dame Folly. More bitter than death. See, the teacher, I think, is saying that he is that sinner of verse 26 who has been ensnared by Dame Folly. Why? Why did he end up like that? Well, as I've just said, I think his quest was wrong-headed from the very start. The great church father, Augustine, in his Confessions, he once said, I was trying to find the origin of evil, but I was quite blind to the evil in my own method of research. And I think the teacher tells us that the same is true of him. His method of trying to find meaning in this life, of trying to find wisdom, of trying to find gain, was wrong all along. Verse 29, he talks about, this only have I found. God created mankind upright, but they've gone in search of many schemes. He said, look, the problem isn't with people per se. God created us with the potential for honesty and uprightness, but the problem is we pervert this by devising devious schemes. And that gives us a clue to what the teacher thinks went wrong with him. Because there's this play on words between the word schemes here and the schemes that the teacher uses to describe his method, to describe his quest. So look at verse 25. He says, I turned my mind to understand, to investigate, and to search out wisdom and the scheme of things. Or verse 27. Look, says the teacher, this is what I've discovered. Adding one thing to another to discover the scheme of things. They're not quite the same word in the Hebrew, but they sound very similar. And I think this wordplay is getting at the idea that actually the teacher's quest, this under the sun perspective of only going on what he can figure out and what he can see, has actually led him into his own version of sinful schemes, distorting God's creation of humanity. Where did he go wrong? What was wrong with his quest? What was wrong with his scheme? Well, I've already just hinted at it. But let me take us right back to the start of the book of Ecclesiastes and just read again the teacher's introduction of his quest and see if you notice anything. Here's how he starts from chapter 1. I, the teacher, was king over Israel in Jerusalem. I applied my mind to study and to explore by wisdom all that is done under the heavens. I have seen all the things that are done under the sun. I said to myself, look, I have increased in wisdom more than anyone. I have experienced much. Then I applied myself to the understanding of wisdom. I said to myself, I could go on and on and on. Do you notice? It's I this, I that, I the other. I is at the centre of everything he's doing here. He's put himself at the centre. Contrast that again with Proverbs chapter 9 and true wisdom. True wisdom, where does that begin? With the fear of the Lord. Not with I, but with the fear of the Lord. And I think this is really important and really relevant for us today, because as we seek to make sense of life and of our world, so often the temptation is to put the trust in I, or to put I, me first. And just look at the nicknames we've got for the different generations. The millennial generation, what is that nicknamed? Generation Me. Why is it nicknamed Generation Me? Because, and this is my generation, at heart, we're really quite narcissistic. we say, I'm going to decide the way that things should be. I'm entitled to this because I'm worth it. The generation that comes later on, what's that been nicknamed? The I generation. Why? Well, partly because of the sort of the technology that they've grown up with, but also because of that idea of the self-reliance, the self-sufficiency. I don't need anyone else. I can just look it up on my iPhone. I can just buy it on iTunes. I'll store it in my iCloud. I've got everything I need. Both those generations, there's a real centre of me. I can do it. But what the teacher is telling us is that wisdom that starts with I is a lie. Wisdom that starts with I is a lie. It's folly. In fact, he says, verse 26, verse 29, it's sin. That's the essence of what sin is. Think about the three letters of sin, S-I-N. Sin is when I is put in the centre of things. And surely that is the first sin in Genesis 3, isn't it? Wanting a wisdom, wanting a knowledge of good and evil that is based on I and not on God. I'll decide what's good and evil rather than relying on what God has said is good and evil. But as I've just said, true wisdom, according to Proverbs, and indeed according to the end of Ecclesiastes, right at the end of the book, true wisdom begins with the fear of the Lord, thinking God's thoughts after him, faith, seeking understanding. Well, just briefly, as we come near to the close, what does that look like? Well, let me just take us to Ecclesiastes 5, just a verse there. Another one of these slight moments of insight for the teacher, as he says, guard your steps when you go to the house of God. Go near to listen rather than to offer the sacrifice of fools who do not know that they do wrong. Do not be quick with your words. Do not be hasty in your heart to utter anything before God. The secret to true wisdom, I think, is listening to God more than we speak. It's relying on God more than we rely on ourselves. You notice the teacher here, he speaks a lot, doesn't he? I mean, he said a lot of stuff in this book of Ecclesiastes. He doesn't do a great deal of listening. But if we want to learn, if we want to know true wisdom, we need to listen. In everyday life, we know that listening is so important to thinking and to knowing rightly. I did a study recently where they found that by the time that preschool children by the time children reach preschool, those from professional families have heard 30 million more words than children from more deprived families. And on average, those children, having heard more, having listened to more, they go on to be better readers, writers, exam results, all that sort of thing. We know it from our own interpersonal skills, doctors, communication skills. They did another study where they found that the average time before a doctor interrupting their patient is 18 seconds. 18 seconds. So the doctor will say, tell me why you've come today. And they'll only give them 18 seconds before interrupting on average. But they found in the same study that if the doctor didn't interrupt the patient, they listened, but they missed less key information, they had a more efficient consultation, and they were more likely to get the right diagnosis. What's the point here? We've got 2 ears and 1 mouth. We're designed to do more listening than we are talking. And the same goes for wisdom, for listening to God. Use our ears for God's word to understand this world. Proverbs constantly portrays the fool as the person who answers before they've actually listened, before they've actually heard. Because that's the wisdom that starts with I, that is actually a lie. But true wisdom needs to start with listening to the Lord. It starts with the fear of the Lord. And that is what the teacher comes to see. That he needs to, if he's going to interpret what's going on in this world rightly, if he's going to understand what's going on in this world rightly, he needs to listen to God. He needs to include God in the equation and allow him to be the centre of things, rather than I and what I can see and what I can think and what I know. So, a question for us: are we listening to God, particularly during this time, these strange times where things are a bit different? Are we making sure that in our new routines of life, we have more time to listen to God, to spend time in His Word, to spend time worshipping with others, perhaps online via these videos? Because wisdom that starts with I is a lie, but true wisdom starts with the fear of the Lord. So we need to listen to Him. Well, I'd love to hear some of your thoughts on some of this stuff. So do join us for Zoom at 8:30, and we can chat through a bit more of this then.